And the combination of all of them will be more powerful than, say, optimizing just one. Aged 50, looking to improve fitness and overall longevity, including lifestyle changes. What features would be essential to consider and what pitfalls to avoid for someone who wants to train at home only, who doesn't like going to the gym? So things become trickier with home-based programs, especially for increasing load on strong body parts like your legs, and the lack of equipment that can challenge the back, for example. So there are a couple of things to consider. It might be possible to get some very basic equipment that can make a difference. Sure, so even low-cost equipment like resistance bands, body weight exercises, and simple props can be very useful. The most important thing to consider here is really consistency. Consistency will outperform any program, no matter how perfect it is. For example, I think there was a study on a 12-week chair-based low-load elastic band resistance training protocol, which improved functional fitness in women and metabolic biomarkers with those that had an adherence over 90%. So adherence and consistency is the most important thing. One of the other tools that might be worth considering is a pull-up bar that you can clip into the doorway. In terms of lifestyle changes, the more straightforward prioritizing sleep. Right? Sleep quality is obviously associated with cognitive function, physical ability, recovery, and mortality outcomes as a whole. A low inflammatory diet, likely a diet high in omega-3 fatty acids, polyphenols, and dietary fiber. They tend to show protective effects. And then sufficient protein intake. This becomes progressively more important the older you get. If you're in your 50s, then protein intake requirements will be higher than if you're in your 30s, likely. In terms of pitfalls, progressing too quickly, not focusing on form, and neglecting proper form, and choosing exercises that exert excessive stress on joints that don't have a solid ROI in terms of what you get back, assuming you were going to train for the next 20 years. There are quite a few gymnastic exercises like this. Are there any measures people can take to slow the aging process? Obviously, we can't stop aging at this point. Who knows what will happen in the future? But we can maximize the body's ability to perform younger, let's say. And the primary ones are always the boring ones, which are things like exercise, right? Both aerobic and resistance training show anti-aging, let's say, effects by extending lifespan, health span, through decreasing a lot of the hallmarks of aging and age-associated inflammation. From a dietary perspective, nutrition strategies include a more plant-based or plant-heavy Mediterranean style, say, pattern, adequate protein intake, and potentially slight calorie restriction, depending on what you're currently doing. A good thing to focus on really is anti-inflammatory diets high in omega-3 fatty acids, antioxidants, and polyunsaturated fat, as opposed to a high saturated fat diet. And then finally, sleep. Adequate sleep quality is associated with all sorts of positive health outcomes, cognitive function, and reduced mortality risk. And ultimately, all three of these work synergistically. And the combination of all of them will be more powerful than, say, optimizing just one. "56-year-old male, just got into strength training recently, combined macro counting and strength training, lost a bunch of weight, and became stronger. Fantastic. Recently, the resistance training has led to back tweaks and having to take multiple weeks off for recovery. And so the situation really illustrates a common pattern, which is successful initial progress, and then injury, and then having to take time off and cycling through this sort of win-lose situation. So things to consider: form and technique. At this stage, perfecting movement patterns and movement overall, and ironing out movement insufficiencies, let's say, is crucial. Exercise ultimately, especially if we're talking about a gym environment, is down to learning new movements which can feel right but be wrong. So here's some ideas. Using external tools like mirrors and then reacting to what you see happening in the mirror to correct the overall pattern. and seeing what it feels like to go through the correct pattern, or using your phone to record performing the particular exercise, to go back, review it, and see what's happening, and also look at other people performing it perfectly so you understand where the discrepancies are. And then think of a training setup like this. All of these 3 steps are non-negotiable, right? Warm up. It's really designed to create blood flow, prepare the body, and lead the body in a direction to correct potential movement deficits that someone might have. And obviously prime, prep, sort of the nervous system and muscles as a whole. We then move into the main section where you have your main exercises designed for you to load them and create enough stimulus for your body to adapt. And then finally, although it looks like it's part of the same section, is you have your accessory exercises, which are designed to, again, create extra stimulus and move you in the direction that you want to go in, but also control overall load and stress on the body. Accessory exercises also often have secondary benefits on the body, such as increasing range of motion or working through movement discrepancies, let's say. And at 56, really, tissue adaptation takes longer, recovery takes longer, so the rule isn't no pain, no gain. It's gradual, consistent progression. I believe there's been research that has shown that in older adults, slower controlled movements can still produce significant strength gains while potentially reducing injury risk. In terms of recovery, obviously, and injury prevention, take time to fully recover. Your body has to unlearn pain to an extent and reduce the tissue sensitivity. And then working with a physical therapist, obviously, or a qualified trainer on proper lifting mechanics. So how heavy should weights be if you're trying to increase bone mineral density because you don't want to end up with your parents who can barely walk around unassisted in their 80s? So for bone density improvement, obviously depends on how old the person currently is and their training experience and so on. But to keep it simple, load matters, but so does the pattern of loading. So let's dive into this a little bit. Progressive resistance training with high loads, so over 70% of someone's 1 rep max, is probably one of the most effective or efficient ways for bone mineral density. But even low loads, high repetition training can increase bone mineral density when combined with proper progression. If we're looking at sort of the characteristics for optimal bone density, it might be things like training frequency, so 3+ times per week, combined with resistance training, higher loads when safe, and then, because these are the areas that tend to decline in bone mineral density, exercises that specifically load the hip and the spine, potentially. So the stimulus for bone adaptation is really mechanical loading that creates sufficient strain. For someone who wants to avoid becoming immobile in their 80s, the focus should be compound movements, progressing over time, and then consistency. Years of training matter more than any single session and however perfectly it might be designed. Since we're talking about progression and consistency, start obviously with loads that you can control, because the aim is to not get injured and be able to perform consistently. What are common myths about health, nutrition, fitness as a whole that have turned out, or I've learned, that are actually false? Let's dive through a couple of ones. Spot reduction works. Spot reduction is ultimately the targeting a specific area with an exercise, expecting fat loss in that particular area. The idea that more exercise is always better. There's a U-shaped relationship. So, in other words, extremely high volumes of vigorous exercise might actually provide additional risk rather than being beneficial overall, especially for those that are over 45. The idea that you need to perform or that you need to exercise for at least 30 minutes for it to be worth it and for there to be any benefits. Even something like walking for 10 minutes has a meaningful impact on health and longevity as a whole. In terms of nutrition, the idea that all calories are equal, I understand from an energy perspective. There is a second layer that's worth considering, which are things like nutrient density, satiety, etc., and how these impact the body overall. So if someone's looking at health long term, only considering calories might not be the best idea. The idea that fat makes you fat, there are obviously fats that are beneficial for health, like omega-3 fatty acids and monounsaturated fat. Neither of which, within the context of overall calorie control, lead to weight gain. The idea that you need protein just after exercise, the actual window, the anabolic window within which you can consume protein, is much longer than people used to think. And then finally, the idea that insulin is the primary driver of fat storage and obesity. And obviously, while insulin does play a role in fat storage, it's not a primary cause for obesity. There have been multiple metabolic ward studies that have shown this to not be true. The carbohydrate insulin model of weight gain doesn't pan out in real life. Ultimately, it comes down to overall energy intake, not whether you're eating more carbs or fewer carbs. What exercises to do for longevity, for someone who hates going to the gym? What can they do instead if they already walk 10,000 steps per day? 10,000 steps is obviously an excellent foundation. Things to consider: bodyweight strength training at home. So things like push-ups, lunges, step-ups on stairs, different plank variations, pull-ups using a bar in the doorway. All of these would be useful. There are multiple activities with longevity benefits. Things like swimming, low impact, and it's full body, right? Cycling, biking, dancing, which has the additional benefit of the social component, and also plays on coordination, right? There's multiple things going on in dancing. Garden type work. You have to go through different ranges of motion and do specific things in that context. And then also things that might not be considered. Things like Tai Chi, for example, which improves balance, flexibility, and has been shown to have health benefits in older adults. But generally, key considerations are resistance to strength training, say twice a week or 2 or 3 times a week. Even 60 minutes per week in total has very beneficial effects. Which types of exercises are best for long-term ROI, activities with the highest return on investment? Walking, especially brisk walking. Brisk walking for 30 minutes, 5 days a week, reduces risk of age-associated disease, and obviously there's low injury risk with walking. You do get the additional benefit of being outside and the impact that has on things like circadian rhythm. Then you have resistance training, strength training, 60 minutes per week. You're already getting a lot of the benefits. While it might not be enough to move the needle for certain metrics, let's say, it already brings with it huge advantages. Why? Because it protects against sarcopenia and maintains bone density. It improves metabolic health. We have aerobic exercise. I'm combining the two, right? Resistance training and aerobic exercise within a week. Research shows that concurrent training programs, in other words, training programs where you have cardiovascular training and you have resistance training, maintains multiple health qualities or fitness qualities. But most importantly is really activities that you will maintain. So consistency over decades matters more than intensity over a couple of months.